Well, hello everyone, and welcome to my library. If you're new here, hi, my name is Cinzia DuBois, and I'm very excited today to be part of the Real Archaeology online conference. Thank you so much, Flint, for including me in this. Obviously, I am not really an archaeologist, I study more ancient history and classical literature, but part of my research for my thesis at the moment is on weaving and storytelling, which is why I thought it'd be really cool to look into the internet connection between how stories can lead us into archaeological discoveries and discussions as which, and how storytelling and archaeology can coincide. So, the first time we meet Helen of Troy is in Book 3 of the Iliad in her chamber. Iris takes the form of Laodike, which is Paris' sister, and finds Helen, quote, weaving a massive double-layered cloth in dazzling colours, patterning upon it the many troubles, tests, and tribulations that Trojan horsemen and bronze-armoured Greeks suffered at Ares' hands because of her. Helen of Troy weaves into textiles that which the poet of the Iliad, Homer, spins into poetry. The pair tell the tale of the Trojan War, one in situ, the other ex situ. Helen is an emblem of the poet and a predecessor of Homer, according to his text. Through him, we are told, it was a woman who documented the tale of the Trojan War before the famous male poet did. But her text, i.e. her textile, is not oral but visual, and made of more organic material than his song, and thus did not stand the test of time. Nagy claims the parallelism between poetic narration and pattern weaving is a matter of metaphor, one which is embedded in the narrative of Homeric poetry. Paul de Man, in Blindness and Insight, uses the apparent relationship between Helen's tapestry and the Homeric bard to comment on the sameness of oral and visual arts. Quote, the self-reflecting mirror effect by means of which a work of fiction asserts is, by its very existence, its separation from empirical reality, its divergence as a sign from a meaning that depends for its existence on the constitutive activity of this sign, characterises the world of literature in its essence. I like when people sum things up nice and easy for me. Weaving and textile manufacturing have been analogous to storytelling for centuries. Tales were woven into tapestries, whilst tales were sung alongside them as they were constructed by groups of women, whose voices, like the tapestries they made, deteriorated and vanished, leaving no archaeological trace aside from the tools that they used. But in a rather poetic turn of events, we can recapture that which is classified as archaeologically invisible through stories, and uncover the details of textiles from the ancient world through glimpses of them that we see in stories that they may have once told. The etymological and metapoetic link between weaving and text is extensive throughout Homeric poetry. Though Homer never directly links weaving to poetry, he does employ the image of weaving words to describe intellectual activity, such as effective rhetoric. Odysseus, Nestor, and Menelaus weave wiles and words, as does Athena, who is the only woman throughout the Homeric text who is depicted as weaving metaphorically. We never see Athena weave, despite being the creator and patron of weaving and the loom. However, we do hear of her weaving skills. In the Iliad Book 5, for example, she is said to remove her ornately woven peplos, which she made herself, with her own hands. The connection between weaving and poetic/song is made more explicitly by Homer through the scenes of Calypso and Circe, who sing whilst weaving. He makes a further connection between weaving and storytelling through Helen's tapestry, detailing the story of the Trojan War. The representation of the poet and their metre as a woven song is an image firmly implanted in the works of Greek lyric poets, and Aristotle observed the mechanical parallels between the poet and the striking the strings of their lyre with their plekton, and the weaver the strings of their loom with their shuttle. Sappho also calls Eros a story weaver, and Callimachus wrote of, quote, the story woven on a staff. Pindar employs weaving as a metaphor frequently throughout his odes, though examples of weaving as a poetic metaphor reside notably in his Menian odes, quote, quickly now, sweet lyre, weave out this song too, and, quote, as he wove his words, an unthrowable wrestler in speech. Additionally, the etymology of text comes from the Latin textus, meaning framework, structure, method of plaiting, web, or woven fabric. Nagy goes even further with this connection, arguing in his book Homer and the Classic that the noun hymnos, meaning hymn or song of praise, one usually to the gods, derives from the verb root heuth, as in Heuphanaean, weave. But what is left of the women's work, both mythologically and archaeologically, is minimal. Women's work in history and text is largely invisible. Whilst we are told that Helen wove of the Trojan War, the contents of other tapestries within Homeric texts, such as those of Penelope and Andromache, are primarily unknown. Some scholars have argued that Penelope's shroud for Laertes may have been a story cloth, considering the length of time she spent weaving it. Similarly, the flowers of Andromache's tapestry may have mythological connotations, but no more details are given. In Emily Wilson's translation of the Iliad, she claims Helen weaves in dazzling colours, which, for anyone familiar with the text, is a rather novel approach. Others, such as Fagles, have famously translated porphyrios, purple, as dark red, crimson, or purple, rather than dazzling colours. The ancient Greeks didn't describe colours the way we do. Their words weren't intended to detail precise shades of colours. Instead, the words for colours covered wider ranges, because the ancient Greeks were more interested in the impression a colour made. Their words aimed to capture elements of colour, such as its saturation, its movement, or poetic nature. For example, the colour of Achilles' hair, xanthos, is popularly translated into blonde or golden, for simplicity. But the word xanthos describes that which is reddish-yellow, blonde, or auburn. And when the word xanthos is applied to horses, it can translate into either sorrel or cream-coloured. Now, purple dye in the ancient Greek world is also deeply significant. The history of shellfish purple, or Tyrion purple, or royal purple, dates back almost 4,000 years. And just like xanthos, the colour ranged from anything from different shades of violet to freshly dried blood and purple red. Hence why many translators choose to translate it as crimson for simplicity. Tyrion Purple was one of the most precious dyes with a supreme reputation, and was thus reserved for the robes of the elite. In his natural history, Pliny the Elder details the procedure of dyeing wool purple in the Roman Empire, and it reads as follows, quote, "The vein already mentioned is then extracted, and about a sextarius of salt added to each 100 pounds of material. It should be soaked for 3 days, for the fresher the extract, the more powerful the dye. Then boiled in a leaden vessel. Next, 500 pounds of dye stuff, diluted with amphora of water, are subjected to an even and moderate heat by placing the vessels in the flue, communicating with a distant furnace. Meanwhile, the flesh, which necessarily adheres to the veins, is stimmed off, and the test is made about the 10th day, by steeping a well-washed fleece in the liquefied contents of one of the vessels. The liquid is then heated till the colour answers to expectations." While Wilson chooses not to describe Helen's tapestry as purple, she does not shun the colour purple entirely. Later in the poem, in Book 22, Andromache also weaves a double-layered purple cloth in the text, which Wilson translates as such. Both Helen and Andromache's tapestries are parallel to one another, and are described as diplica porphyreos. Whilst porphyreos means purple, porphyreos can also mean gleaming, glittering, or shimmery. Homer famously calls the sea wine dark in colour, but sometimes he also calls it purple. Porphyreos as a word describes a mix of brightness and movement, as well as the colour purple. As Wagner Hazel explains, we see purple dye in the clothing of high-status individuals who wear it in epic poetry, such as Agamemnon, Achilles, Nestor, Thoas, Odysseus, and Telemachus. In the Iliad, Achilles is said to bring with him purple-coloured textiles from Thessaly, and Agamemnon wears a purple mantle. Similarly, it's believed purple played a huge role in the Panathenaea. The Panathenaea was an Athenian festival celebrated every June over multiple days in honour of the goddess Athena, who, it is important to reiterate in this paper, was the patron of spinning and weaving. During the festival, a peplos was pattern woven for the great presentation to Athena at the Great Panathenea. And according to detailed descriptions in ancient sources, the peplos was purple, and we know from sculptures and paintings that the peplos depicted the gigantomachy. The Appendix Virgiliana, Kairos, details how, during the festival, the Athenian ship of a state adorning a pattern-woven peplos of Athena was rigged to the mast of a ship as a stylized sail, and that was paraded on wheels along the route of the Panathenaic procession. It is said that this peplos was dyed of a purple so deep it appears like the colour of red. Now, all this purple talk may sound like a tangent detached from archaeology, but this is where weaving, storytelling and archaeology intersect. First, let's look at the gleaming element of purple, which is an adjective also employed when describing the gleaming of women's linen as well as gifts, including metalwork and textiles. This gleaming, whilst poetic, also reflects the archaeological reality of the colour thanks to its production. Tyrion Purple comes from the secretion of sea snails, and this stinky and time-consuming process was as significant to the ancients as mining for gold. In fact, in visual art, when the sheen of gold could not be represented appropriately, it was marked by the colour purple for both its gleaming nature and its status. Murex was extracted from the mollusks whilst they were still alive, before the murex was exposed to sunlight, during which it changed colour. However, this took a very long time, as for every gram of dye, up to 12,000 mollusks were needed. The colour was less produced after the fall of the Byzantine and Roman empires, and it was completely lost to history by the 14th century. It was only thanks to experimentations in the 21st century that the technique for extracting this colour was rediscovered in just 2001. Now, during the extensive excavations in the palace of the Katna complex in Syria, excavations noticed patches of brown staining on the floor of a high-status tomb. After chemically extracting the stain, they discovered the presence of brominated derivatives of indigo and indirubin, with its source likely being that of a hexaplex trunculus, i.e. sea snails. Right on an archaeological site, they discovered the renowned Tyrion or royal purple that was mentioned by Pliny. As James et al. Explain, the loci of several of the purple-coloured extracts were associated with the presence of precious artefacts, which likely included decorated garments or fabrics adorning corpses. Naturally, the textiles decayed, but they believed the pigments found were sediment extracts of the remnants of royal purple used to dye those fabrics. What's more incredible is that they found the ghosts of those fabrics. Conducting microscopic hand sorting of sediments collected from the tomb floor, the team discovered thousands of millimetre-sized fragments of textile, identifiable from weave patterns, with many of them exhibiting traces of colour. Further, X-ray crystallography and electron microscopy showed that textile fragments were preserved as fossilised gypsum replicas. That being said, this isn't to say that the myths accurately always portray the archaeological reality of ancient weaving practices. Something that we see painted on pottery, but less so mentioned in ancient texts, is the collaborative nature of textile production. Whilst unnamed women or enslaved women are described as weaving in groups, such as the 7 women skilled in all crafts Agamemnon bargains Achilles with as a peace offering, or the 50 enslaved girls spinning yarn in Alkinoi's palace, and the enslaved Sidonian women who craft the ornately woven robes for Hecuba, named women such as Penelope, Calypso and Circe, Andromache and Helen are presented in a way that suggests they're working alone, particularly divine women. But weaving in the ancient world was far from a solo craft. Textile manufacturing was a long and intensive labour. Depending on the size of the cloth being woven, the loom might as well be over a metre wide, and for weaving a peplos, most estimates put the width of the loom as 1.45 to 1.85 metres. Spinning and weaving experiments conducted by researchers have attempted to calculate rough estimations of how time-consuming these practices were in the Mycenaean textile production. Using records from linear bead tablets, the researchers could see that every woman was expected to deliver one piece of cloth, which was either of the quality of a tipa, which is 21 kilos of raw wool. As a test, Nosh used the Scandinavian experimental archaeology and expert spinners and weavers to estimate what one person could spin. They found out that one person could spin an average of 20 metres of thread per hour. If these estimations translated over to Mycenaean women over a 10-hour workday, it would take one woman 1,950 hours, or 195 days, to produce just one teeper. And that would be using a 30-gram spindle. But if they were only using a 5-gram spindle, that time would increase to 700 days. Carr estimates that for a family of 3 free adults and a child and 2 slaves, the adult textile production would take 38 to 47 hours of work a week. Now, teeper were not decorative and were required in mass amounts, meaning tens, if not hundreds of women and children were required to work on them. I recently heard Emily Hauser speak about her upcoming book, Mythica, in which she talks all about how ancient women and archaeology intersect. Now, in her paper she delivered, she specifically spoke of Calypso and the incongruence between her textile manufacturing ability and the historical reality of such a production output. Hauser pointed out that in Book 5 of the Odyssey, Calypso, who allegedly worked alone, constructed a sail for Odysseus along with clothes in just a 4-day period. Yet the estimated time for one woman to produce a sail using a weighted loom is 4 years, let alone the time it would take for her to produce the clothes for Odysseus as well. So we can only imagine how many theoretical women and children would have been needed to produce enough sails to launch 1,000 ships. But if it had just been Calypso in charge of the production line using her scale, it would have still taken 10 years, 11 months and 2 weeks and 6 days to produce 1,000 sails, which is a lot. So translate that into real life with real people. There was a lot of weaving going on in the ancient world. But that's everything for today's mini little lecture on weaving and storytelling. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much again to Flint and everyone for organising Real Archaeology. I really enjoyed being part of it. I hope you enjoyed the paper as well. And if you're interested, I talk all about dark ancient history and mythology and the stories from it. So if you're interested, please consider liking and subscribing. And if you're also interested in technically my more personal PhD research, I do have a third channel where I have a plan of lots of little videos I'm releasing on there. So if you have any questions and you're interested, I will leave a link to that channel down below because that's all launching soon. Thank you so much again for listening, and remember, be happy and healthy, and books save lives. So keep reading.